You've been watching the press conference at the Pentagon there. We have now learned the operation named Midnight Hammer. Yeah. Remarkable details in the operation as the world watched B-2 stealth bombers fly west towards Hawaii and Guam. 7 B-2 bombers, 2 crew members each, refueling, flying east, delivering their targets, hitting their targets, 14 total bombs under total stealth. Not a single shot fired, says Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Cain, saying that no missiles were launched, no shots fired at our mission, no Iranian planes got airborne. They simply didn't see it. I want to bring back the special report anchor and our executive editor, Brett Baer. Brett, it's remarkable, these details, to learn that we literally got in and out without really being detected, hit all targets. It just strikes you at really the dominance. We heard from Secretary Hegseth, the unmatched capability of the American military, but boy, you really got to see it here and likely sending a message to those that would do us harm.
Definitely. This is exactly what we were hoping for. Some details, as you mentioned, 7 B-2 bombers. This is the largest B-2 mission ever in the history of the U.S., dropping 14 of these massive ordnance penetrator bombs. Remember, those are 30,000 pounds each, the GBU-57. That's 420,000 pounds of ordnance just in the B-2 bombers dropping on those 3 nuclear sites. Then you add some 30-plus Tomahawk missiles from U.S. submarines. You've got 75 precision-guided bombs falling on these nuclear sites. Essentially, the message was, we're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program, and there is time for Iran to get back to the table, and the president seeks peace. But as we talked about before we came to this press conference, and Rachel, you mentioned the deception and the effort to really tighten down on operational security. You heard a little bit about that. Not only decoy planes going different places, also ghost planes on radars, as well as the B-2s going to the west, while others flew from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. They are not saying exactly what the battle damage assessment is. Rightfully so. They're waiting for some more details on the ground. But that's really the big question. Where does Iran's nuclear program stand tonight or today? And this sounds like it is pretty devastated and decimated.
Brett, do you have any sense as to how they, quote-unquote, complete a BDA, a battle damage assessment? Because, you know, at this point, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's unlikely that the Iranians are going to welcome in inspectors to look at what's left.
Yeah, the Israelis are on the ground. They're on the ground in significant numbers. We don't know exactly how, where, when, but they will provide some battle damage assessment from the ground, and then obviously our satellites and what we have in the air can give us decent pictures. I think the question about the nuclear material is what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was asked, and said he's going to need more time. I was struck by, you know, this isn't about regime change. This is very precision. We talked about that going in. That was the message from the president last night, and it is one in which the Iranian leadership has to make a decision now. But if there is an attack on a U.S. facility, U.S. people, U.S. soldiers, U.S. bases, all bets are off.
Brett, they were asked, Secretary Hegseth was asked if the administration is in direct contact with Iran. Of course, he said yes, public and private measures, but something he said they know exactly what steps they need to take for peace. He didn't say what those steps are. What do you think those steps are?
Well, to give up enrichment has been one of the bars to start, and I think there's a long list that they've been talking about with the Europeans that has circulated around that the Iranians turned their back on in Geneva. They may turn their back the other way, go back to the table, considering what they just saw last night. But we'll see. The question really is the Iranian leadership and when we hear from them. So far, it's been a lot of bluster online, a lot of social media saying, you know, the response is yet to come. It is going to be devastating for Israel and the U.S. Clearly, we'll see. And we mentioned the tentacles of terrorist cells that we really have to be careful of.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Brett, I was really also struck by Pete Hegseth, in particular, Secretary Hegseth, talking about the desire for peace, the desire to make sure that this does not go beyond these strikes, that Donald Trump, the president, wants them at the negotiating table to end this. That was very encouraging to somebody like me who's very concerned about this expanding into regime change. That felt good. On the other hand, there's a lot of tripwires here. We've got the bases that are there that are somewhat vulnerable. Despite the threats from the U.S. government saying, don't touch our men. We also have the Houthis who have now torn up their ceasefire agreement, so there could be something that happens to our ships in the Red Sea. And then, of course, what I'm most concerned about is the fact that we've had 4 years of Joe Biden's open border and these sleeper cells. So talk to me about how President Trump, Homeland Security, Pete Hegseth, everybody involved is working to mitigate those very real threats, on the homeland included, to make sure this doesn't expand into a greater war. Because as you know, Brett, there's a lot of political implications here. By the way, we're not hearing much about the big, beautiful bill that was the #1 issue until Israel striked. But also the fact that, you know, this is not a left-right issue. There are a lot of people in the MAGA base who voted for Donald Trump because they wanted peace and really hope that this leads to peace. So I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but talk to me about the politics around this, considering all of those things.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the threat of the terrorist reach of the Iranian regime, which has been doing it for decades through proxies, doing some very bad things. You know, the president came to the conclusion that those tentacles, those terrorist reach elements, with a nuclear weapon or some nuclear even a dirty bomb, is exponentially more of a threat to the U.S. and to our allies, and decided it was time to act. If you're worried about, you know, the retaliation, imagine the retaliation with Iran with a nuclear bomb. Let's just put that aside. Yeah. There is a higher state of alert. The FBI, the Homeland Security, individual cities have been on higher states of alert since this all happened over the past week or so, but now they'll be even more so. And the amount of strength, military strength we have in the region suggests they're going to do a lot to try to protect those bases directly beyond what is normally done. As for the politics of this, you know, you're right. There is no left and right. There are Republicans who say it's not constitutional, who say that there should be, Congress should weigh in. However, you have Democrats who say this is the right move and it protects the homeland. I think there's going to be a lot of vocal voices. The question is next steps. And right now, the president's signaling that this is a very limited operation unless Iran acts to get us in. Israel's not going to convince the U.S. to do anything more than we're saying we're going to do. And I think that boots on the ground are completely off the table.
You know, Brett, we were just showing our viewers the photos at the White House, been in that Pentagon press briefing. I think my question would have been to Chairman Cain, what was behind, what's the story behind his looked like Texas hook'em horns in a downward position? He seemed to be like literally physically showing us some sort of operational, explaining it. And, you know, I think we pull that one up here and you'll see it in just a second. But what's interesting, Brett, is, you know, when you were talking about the proxies, Hezbollah hasn't fired a single shot. Hamas is on its back. The Houthis, very, very neutralized. You wonder if they're taking in some of this and listening, perhaps particularly, there's the shot, that one right there. He's talking about an operation which has once again shown American dominance globally at a time when there wasn't the deterrence of the last administration. Now, obviously, American deterrence appears to be back. You've got to think the proxies are paying very close attention to this.
Yeah, definitely. It looks to me like there's 2 bunker buster bombs coming out of 2 B-2s heading towards Fordo, but I'm just guessing there. Yeah. And by the way, as far as asking those questions in the briefing, it does bring me back to those days of being in that front row. And there are still some guys there that are there from the time that I was there. They're a little bit grayer, but they are very knowledgeable about the U.S. military as they ask those questions. I think, yeah, you have to watch not only the Iranian leadership, but what you hear from Hezbollah, which, by the way, so far has been very quiet since the pager walkie-talkie attack by Israel. Their leadership hasn't piped up at all. Hamas, there are really not a lot of leaders. They're in hiding, and the Houthis in Yemen have really taken it on the chin. Their leadership just taken out. The Israelis took out a meeting just last week of the Houthi leadership. So we'll see. They're not impotent. They have a response. Iran does, and that's what the U.S. has to watch very closely.
Brett, to build on Griff's question here, beyond the rebel groups, there was one line in there. Pete Hegseth said it exactly like this, showing the world that American deterrence is back. Griff alluded to that. I hear that, and I think beyond those rebel groups, to the question I asked you before we got into the press conference, to me, that's sending a message to Russia, that's sending a message to North Korea, and just like firing missiles at Syria during dessert, this sends a message to Xi Jinping that we mean business, we are going to use our might to deter, and you better watch out and not do something stupid. Was that your takeaway?
100%. It reestablishes deterrence for the U.S., a president that is willing to pull the trigger despite political wins in his own party that perhaps are pushing him not to. He is willing to act on the intelligence he gets as well as his gut instinct in his mind to protect the United States. That is his definition of America first, and that sends a message not just to Iran, but to Russia and to China as they encircle Taiwan. It sends a message that the U.S. is willing to act with the best and biggest military in the world. Do we want to get engaged around the world? No. Can we afford to be in two wars at the same time? No. But action and reaction to things that are happening, clearly that was a signal around the world.
Brett, do we have a clear understanding of whose intel this was based on? Is it Israeli intel, American intel? I know that a lot of Americans are, they trust Donald Trump, President Trump. They absolutely trust Pete Hegseth. But the intel apparatus that was in place before is still there. And this is the intel apparatus that, told us that there was Russia collusion and there was weapons of mass destruction. And so how can we as Americans know that we're getting the best intel and that it's not biased?
I totally agree with you asking those questions. And ahead of the Iraq War, we asked a lot of questions, and there were 17 international intelligence agencies that told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't the case. So there are real questions. At the end of that briefing, you heard that reference to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard's testimony on Capitol Hill in March, in which she said they are moving forward with their nuclear as far as their material. However, the decision has not been made to move forward with a bomb. Between March and this action today, the president said he's convinced that he's seen intelligence that suggests that they were moving forward and getting closer to the point where he thought it was imminent. That is what the Israeli prime minister says. And now Tulsi Gabbard and others have linked up saying that it was moving forward to the point where it was a threat. You have to trust it until we see it, but that is what they are saying publicly and answering that question.
Well, just adding to Rachel's question, which is really such an important question about that, it does appear, unlike Iraq you referenced, that the intelligence this time is at least much clearer insofar as we had this May 31 report out of the IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog, for the first time breaking in 20 years, saying that Iran was in breach of nuclear non-proliferation treaty, enriching uranium up to 60%. They say this, Brett, they say, quote, the fact that Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state in the world that is producing and accumulating uranium enriched to 60% remains a matter of serious concern. That's coming at the end of May, and it does track, obviously, we would assume, with our intelligence.
Exactly. And so what IAEA essentially was saying was they are enriching past the point of the civilian program. They are enriching uranium. They have the material, but they have not made the decision to move forward with a bomb. So the Iranians are saying we're not going to make a bomb, yet we're stockpiling this weapons-grade material, and tomorrow they could turn and say we want to make a bomb. That was the imminent threat. And the IAEA was public on that. I think there was more intelligence that suggested other things were happening as far as moving components around Iran.
Well, Brett, thank you for joining us this morning. Thanks for hanging with us during the press briefing. Of course, everybody can see you on a special edition of Special Report tonight at 6 p.m.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Brett.
We'll see you then.
Thank you, Brett.